Now let's talk about juvenile treatment courts. Dr. Gallagher, let's talk about behavioral disorders in children and how you treat these behaviors. Do you believe, and I know you've done a lot of research, but talk to me about what did you think when you first got into it? Was it nature or nurture? And what has your research shown you that it is?
Yeah, and that's a great question and a great topic that as a social work researcher, we're still trying to figure out, we're still exploring, is it nature or nurture? Now, certainly, we can comfortably say it's both, okay? With addictions, so the disease of addiction, we have a lot more research to speak to the genetic component of it. But with behavioral disorders, and the two most common behavioral disorders that we see in young men and young women in juveniles are ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder, and then also conduct disorder. We see a genetic component there, but we, I would say at a larger scale, see that nurturing component. And what I mean by that is there is a high prevalence of trauma. And I'm talking about significant physical, sexual, emotional trauma that these young men and young women experience that seems to be associated with the behavioral disorders. For example, for years when I was in Indiana, I worked at Basher Children's Home. It was a children's home, a residential home where young men and young women were either ordered there by the juvenile justice system. So instead of going to juvenile prison, they came to Basher's Children's Home for treatment, for care, or the juveniles were referred through the child welfare system. And I could safely say that 80 to 90% of the young men and young women at Basher Children's Home had significant histories of repetitive traumas occurring to them in their lives. So when we take a look at nature versus nurture, we know a lot when it comes to, say, drug addiction and the genetic component. There's still more we need to know genetically about behavioral disorders in kids, such as, ADHD, and then, as I mentioned earlier, oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. But we absolutely know there is this, environmental nurturing component, and it ties back to one primary issue, trauma. And that actually speaks to kind of the second half of the title of our presentation in April, is a paradigm shift from what's wrong with the child to what has happened to the child. And so in our presentation, one of the topics that I'll be talking about is how to best treat oppositional defiant disorder and how to best treat conduct disorder. And we'll be having a very real conversation about the problematic behaviors that are associated with these disorders. Oppositional defiant disorder, now again, this would be a very simple, basic understanding of it, but it is a consistent pattern of impulsivity. Think of it as extreme impulsivity that has a negative impact on others as well as the individual's ability to functioning, their quality of life. So extreme impulsivity, oppositional defiant disorder. Conduct disorder is on the whole other end of the spectrum. It is planned, premeditated, controlled problematic behaviors that have a significant impact on the well-being, safety, life of others, as well as the individual themselves. And so one of the examples I typically share to compare and contrast both disorders, oppositional defiant disorder is a young man in school who gets upset at the teacher, does not control his or her emotions, and impulsively picks up a chair and throws it at the teacher. It's a very problematic behavior. Conduct disorder is a young man or a young woman, the teacher, ticked me off. I'm upset at the teacher. And I'm not going to throw the chair right now. I'm going to wait until she turns around and isn't looking. And then I'm going to pick up the chair in a controlled, planned way and throw it. And in this presentation, I will be talking about those two disorders, talking about with those disorders, particularly conduct disorders, we'll be talking about real issues like rape, murder, arson, robbery, assault, very serious behaviors that we need to address through a juvenile justice lens, very serious behaviors that we may need to address through incarceration, or at least putting someone in a residential home away to protect the community. So in no way am I not supporting those methods. Sometimes incarceration is needed. Sometimes, being referred or mandated to a children's home is mandated, because we're talking about very serious behaviors. But the theme, and I think Grace mentioned it earlier, is we will be approaching the treatment of these very serious behavioral disorders through a social work lens of empathy and compassion. We can hold people accountable. We can deal with some of the most serious crimes that young men and young women could do unto others, again, such as rape, murder, assault. And we can always respond to it in a kind, compassionate, social work-based method. So it will certainly produce real conversations, necessary conversations. But one thing I will say, even with these most egregious behaviors, with conduct disorder, you may see it's common for young men and young women with conduct disorders to cause harm to animals. So they may kill animals, harm animals, very serious behaviors. With good treatment, good intervention, oftentimes through the juvenile justice system, even with these very serious behaviors, recovery is absolutely possible. If they get good quality of care, good treatment, there can be healing, recovery, and change that can be done coupled with public safety. So that'll be the one issue or theme, behavioral disorders, that I will be presenting on. And Brooke Seam will be talking about antidepressant withdrawal, particularly antidepressant medications with juveniles. And then the students will be talking about, as you shared earlier, juvenile drug courts.